In this roundup of the week, the US media shows shocking partisan bias as America sinks deeper into crisis. The UK is faced with the evidence of Russia's attempts to do it harm, and Britain's climate campaigners turn against each other. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for Changemakers. Welcome once again to the seriously low-budget soap opera that is 2020. I hope you're well and dodging the virus. But in order to do that, do you need to avoid protests? A few weeks ago I suggested that the Black Lives Matter protests might well have been part of what seeded the rise of cases in the southern part of the US. And it wasn't made as a partisan point. Whether you're protesting for the right reasons or the wrong reasons, the virus doesn't care. But it would explain why the early surge was made up of predominantly younger people, since that's largely who was protesting. Well, this week, President Trump piled in and said the same thing. Who knew he was watching my videos? It's surely only weeks away now before I get my own Fox News TV show. Well, maybe not. And of course, because President Trump has said it, now the other side really have to double down and suggest that no way could this be true. Evidence is secondary now. Once something has emerged from President Trump's mouth, you can forget what the evidence is either way. And whatever you think about Trump, you should be disturbed by how partisan the reporting has become. So first of all, they say, well, it can't have been the protests because the protests took place in New York and Chicago, Washington and other cities where there hasn't been a spike. But of course, as I've seen there before, we already know that cities that were hit hard in the first wave have not seen a marked uptick as the lockdowns have been relaxed. We've seen that all over the world. And even though the experts said that you needed higher rates of infection before you reached herd immunity, something of that sort is clearly what we're seeing. And experts are speculating on the factors that are at play. So saying that protests took place in those cities and nothing happened, it's no proof. No proof they didn't spark a surge in the cities that hadn't yet been hit. And then they point to a study that I've also discussed before. The Guardian described it like this. In many cities, the protest actually seemed to lead to a net increase in physical distancing as more people who did not protest decided to stay off the streets. And yes, indeed, the young people went on protests and some of them were violent enough that older people decided to keep well away from them because they were scared of becoming victims of violence. And then we saw a wave of infections with young people and very few older people. Exactly what you would expect to have seen under those circumstances. Which then starts to equalise out over time because younger people give it to the older people and so on. And we started to see that as well. The research they're quoting actually admitted that the protest probably did lead to the infections. It just argued that this was offset by those people who stayed home and avoided them and therefore didn't get infected. But the press was saying things like, President suggests demonstrations led Americans to lower their guard, but experts see little evidence they spread virus. Which is just not true. Even the research that story itself cited said that it wasn't true. And in this case, Trump very reasonably didn't suggest it was the only reason. A substantial increase in travel was also a cause, increased gatherings on holidays such as Memorial Day, as well as young people closely congregating at bars and probably other places, maybe beaches. Now, we all know that sometimes Trump says wacky stuff, even if Kanye West is doing his best to make Trump look like the moderate centre ground. We know he says dumb stuff all the time. But here's an example where the president said something that in a sane world would have been credited as a logical take. But in this world, now he said it, there is zero chance that any mainstream left-wing media is going to permit any suggestion that this might conceivably be true. And maybe it isn't. I'm still open to an alternative hypothesis that fits the facts. But it seems nobody's interested in explaining why New York and other cities are not seeing a new spike, except that a number of people are saying that it's because those cities have done the right thing. And that's why they're not seeing another spike. Which is strange, because New Jersey and New York had the highest death rate per capita in the world from COVID-19. So arguing that they've been doing the right thing, well, it seems a brave position from a purely pragmatic standpoint. But then, if there's any sense left anywhere, it's not immediately obvious. Here in the UK, we've come through one of the worst incidences of anywhere in the world on the basis of deaths per million. At least we think so. I mean, remember, the data is largely junk. In any case, we are well at the end of it now. Many fewer infections, many fewer deaths. And now is the time, right now is the time, when the government decides to make the wearing of face masks compulsory. Unless you're at the office. And unless you're going into a takeaway food shop. Oh wait, no, we have an update. Now, including if you're going into a food shop. But you can take the mask off if you sit down and eat food. Actually, no, you can go in without the mask if you're going to eat food, because fiddling with the mask might be worse than not having one. For now, anyway. But entrepreneurs with an eye to the opportunities are probably already designing face masks with holes in them so that you can suck up your food with a straw. Needless to say, many people have now reached a position of total bafflement. What are we meant to do today? And you know, look, I'm a law-abiding kind of fella. But yeah, start to ask, and does it really matter? We've been largely opened up for a number of weeks. There's no new spike, a couple of local hotspots, but where's the evidence that now it's important to do this? And don't get me wrong, show me the evidence and I'll accept it with a speed that'll get half the audience of this channel rolling their eyes and typing in all caps, "Wake up, sheeple!" But there is no new evidence. People seem to have given up trying to work out what's going on. We just have arbitrary changes day by day, apparently disconnected from logic. And of course, people have given up trying to work out what's going on because they've just decided that they already know what's going on. And by sheer coincidence, it's whatever they wanted it to be. Toby Young, the founder of the Lockdown Skeptics website, pointed out that lots of newspapers and think tanks and others are now all gearing up to run their own independent inquiries. We've already seen the Sunday Times, the New Statesman, and last week the Financial Times launching theirs. And Toby Young said this: "Few will be able to resist blaming the UK's higher than average death toll on the government's failure to lock down earlier." That's been the verdict of those that have been published so far. And we know in advance that Sir Patrick Vallance and Neil Ferguson will confirm this when they're asked to testify by Uncle Tom Cobley and all. They've said as much already. The only thing all these non-partisan panels of experts will disagree about is exactly how many dead bodies can be chalked up to Boris Johnson's dither and delay. Toby then described the inquiry he'd like to hold, with all the alternative voices, such as Dr. John Lee, the ex-professor of pathology, who's written a series of sceptical pieces for The Spectator magazine, and a number of other characters in a similar vein. Surely the point is that we want an independent inquiry that listens to all the different voices and perspectives without any prior assumptions. I mean, if the purpose of the inquiry is to work out what we should do better if and when it happens again, that's what you would do. If you're just seeking permission to blame somebody, then obviously that's not what you want to do. And unfortunately, the mainstream media seems to be playing that game, not just in this area, but in a number of areas. If you doubt that they're highly partisan at this stage, at least in the US, it's worth pondering why they haven't been talking about Isaiah Jackson. We remember, don't we, that when a group of young people vaguely smiling in the face of protesters created massive headlines, condemnation and outrage. It wasn't that long ago. It turned out to be false outrage because the situation wasn't as depicted. But that's almost a by the by. Could have been true. And there's no doubt the outrage that was considered to be appropriate had it been. Well, this week another photo emerged of a black man who has been identified as Isaiah Jackson, a Black Lives Matter protester, kneeling on the neck of a white 2-year-old toddler whose arms are being held behind his back by another person. Probably he wasn't applying any pressure on his neck, and apparently the child was inspected and found to be uninjured. But the photo is testament to the fact the toddler was not enjoying the experience because he was screaming. And it's sufficiently bad that Jackson has been arrested on the basis of that picture alone. I'm not showing it here is pretty shocking, and even showing it would mean this video would definitely be demonetized for showing a violent act. There's a link in the video description. But why isn't there any outrage in the New York Times or Washington Post or CNN about it? I mean, seriously, it's as disturbing a picture as you could get. Those outlets were so quick to talk about the Trump-supporting protesters mimicking the George Floyd incident, which is massively tame by comparison to this. This was with a toddler, a 2-year-old. Nothing. Not the New York Times, not the Washington Post, not CNN, not a thing. You have to go to Fox News on the other side, a handful of right-leaning websites. So how come? The only apparent difference is that this is a Black Lives Matter protester, that it was a black adult kneeling on the neck of a white child. One has to speculate that had it been the other way round, it would have made extensive headlines. Now, regardless of your editorial position, you should be able to cover the news, shouldn't you? I mean, come on. And, this was news, right? We don't have to believe that this garbage person is representative of BLM protesters generally, whether you think highly of them or not. And he's certainly not representative of black people in America. But you're not going to even report it because it doesn't fit the favoured narrative of the moment? I find that astonishing. So, if you want to understand what's happening in the US right now, you really do have to watch the sources from both sides, because they are actively censoring the things that don't fit their version of reality. What happened to the supposedly noble craft of journalism? And it matters, of course, because these are momentous times. In Portland, there have been riots with lawless protesters attacking the police, destroying property, encouraged and even egged on by weak Democrat leadership. That's one version. Alternatively, valid protests are being turned into violent confrontations by President Trump, sending federal paramilitary goons to grab people off the street for no reason and to enforce a dictatorial iron rule across the nation. That's the other version. Now, it's not really that surprising, obviously, because this is an election year. And just about everything that happens in the space between now and November is going to be about winning that election. But the tempo has just become so outraged. So the radical campaigners who suddenly found that the killing of George Floyd resulted in a nationwide wave of revulsion will, of course, be doing everything they can to hold on to the momentum that they believe this gave them for as long as they can, and up to the election itself if they can. But of course, leaderless movements are prone to following bad strategies, or actually no strategies at all, and are vulnerable to the counterproductive actions of mavericks. Mavericks like Isaiah Jackson, for example, which is perhaps why the liberal media are trying to protect them from his actions. It would damage the movement. The Democratic state administrations are caught in a bind. From what I've seen, their strategy is to align themselves with the protests, hoping that in so doing they'll encourage them to tone down a bit, to stand in contrast to the actions of the Trump administration and therefore to win public support. Because they do follow a strategy of kinds. And that's what they calculate will give them the best outcome. And it hasn't been tremendously successful so far because the radical campaigners want to tear institutions down. They certainly don't want to be co-opted. So we saw this in Portland, where Mayor Ted Wheeler went out among the crowds and getting tear-gassed alongside them, which, shows a certain commitment. But they still shouted him down when he made a speech telling them how much he stood with them. Unfortunately for Wheeler and the rest, that makes them look weak and not in control of a very volatile situation. And then you have the Trump administration, which knows that its base values a strong stance on law and order and judges that the mid-ground voters, the swing voters, well, they probably do as well, especially if they see the other side as being weak in the face of it. If a president can use federal forces to quell the riots, then that will work well for him. The Democrat states are furiously trying to stop him, the rioters want to fight the forces and win, and to some extent sweep along the more moderate protesters along with them. So you can take your pick, which side you're going to support and why. But it's worth noting two things. One, in highly polarised times, with an election coming where the stakes are really high, all of these people are just playing the hand that's been dealt to them. Two, this is exactly the sort of division that the enemies of the United States and the West generally, it's exactly what they thrive on. And we reconfirmed this in the UK this week, when we saw the release of the long-awaited Russia report from the Parliamentary Intelligence and Security Committee. The report talks about what our intelligence services know about the nefarious things the Russian state has been getting up to in terms of interfering in elections and otherwise trying to bring us down. And I mean literally bring us down, not just make us a little sad. And it's been long awaited because the government refused to publish it before the election. So people decided it must contain some really big, huge smoking gun. Something the government doesn't want you to know, which is obviously like catnip to everyone. Of course, anything really sensitive was redacted because, Russian agents can read as well. So there's a bunch of stuff that we still don't know. I read the full report the morning it was launched, and this was my take. First, that it was only in the wake of the release of the hacked emails in the 2016 US election that the British intelligence community fully woke up to the potential threat posed by Russia to our democratic processes. Second, none of the different agencies had wanted to go there because apparently they were all extremely nervous of anything that could be interpreted from the outside as attempting to interfere themselves in the outcome of a British election or a referendum. This was partly a result of the explosive divisions around Scottish independence and, of course, Brexit. And the committee suggested that, while such reluctance might even be understandable, defending the integrity of the processes was nevertheless absolutely key. Elections and referenda in the UK are still carried out on a paper-based system. There was no suggestion that Russia had been able to directly interfere with the process itself. But of course, a lot of focus has been on disseminating polarising, often false stories to increase division. Fake news. And much of the activity detected by Russia during the two referenda and the general election were more to do with promoting deep division rather than getting a specific outcome. And that's why the Russian troll farms, by the way, have jumped all over the Black Lives Matter protests. According to a US Senate Intelligence Committee investigation into the 2016 election, no single group was targeted more by Russia than African Americans. One Facebook page they operated, Blacktivist, got 11.2 million user engagements, more than 360,000 likes, which was more than the official Black Lives Matter page managed in the same time period. Third, one of the key challenges was the degree to which Russian oligarchs, some of whom had personal connections with Putin himself, had become integrated into the top levels of British society thanks to their money and influence. And this was something that had happened incrementally over the years. People hadn't really been paying attention till suddenly you turned around and you just realised how embedded these people had become. And finally, there was the admission that after the end of the Cold War, and with the rise of Islamic extremism and international terrorism, the percentage of time devoted to monitoring the Russian state activity went down, as that devoted to thwarting terrorist attacks went up. Which, come on, you'd expect. And they did a pretty good job in protecting the UK from that terrorist activity. So, it's not as though they were all slacking and playing computer games. But at the lowest point, this enabled Russia to take a number of steps without really raising any alarm bells. The percentage has gone back up again, since although the exact percentage of resource now dedicated to monitoring Russia was redacted. So that was my take. The report was in the tone of voice that said, this is the situation. We need to change some things that we're doing to meet that situation. I didn't read it as being big on blame in any way. It's always interesting when you see an event for yourself or you read a report for yourself, then seeing exactly how the media decide to report on it. The first thing that became evident was that at least some of the journalists were bitterly disappointed that there was no smoking gun when it came to Brexit. I'm not a mind reader, but it seemed to be the case that they had been hoping for some solid evidence that Russian interference had swung the Brexit result. Even at this point, when it's now too late to change anything because Britain has officially left the EU, they were still hoping that something would show it had been in some way illegitimate. But in any case, it wasn't in the report. And indeed, there was very little evidence of anything in the report, because Things that might have counted as actual evidence were in the redacted parts. But what it did identify loud and clear was more detail around what we kind of already knew in principle already. That Russia, and one has to say probably China as well, see the disruption of the West by sowing division, anger, fake news and the rest as something that serves its interests. Russia may have been hit hard by the virus and hit hard by the slump in oil prices, but if its opponents are similarly weakened and fighting internally within their countries and fighting amongst themselves as democratic nations, then maybe Russia can still come out on top. And whether the West is polarized as a happy coincidence for Russia, and it's just a process that it can enjoy stirring up every now and then, or if it's actually because of the interventions over the last decade. Nevertheless, there's no doubt that indeed we are divided and we have been fighting hard. You have to imagine that in Putin's mind, in this video, we are the antelopes, the lion is Russia, if not Putin personally. I'm not personally of the view that Russia or China caused the division, exacerbated it for sure, but wherever we have the option to do the positive thing, we do seem to choose to do the other thing. For instance, what could we do today that would make the world a better place? Maybe we could help solve a problem. Maybe we could make a product that solves somebody else's problems. Or we could help another human being through kindness. Or how about this? We could throw paint over the front door of Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth and Christian Aid. Now, I can imagine there's some of my regular viewers who think that throwing paint at Greenpeace might actually be of some value. Shame on you! But if you do, then meet your new ally in struggle, Roger Hallam, co-founder of Extinction Rebellion. Hallam has set up what he describes as a new political party, although, as I've mentioned here before, it's a party like no other. And the clue's in the name because it's called Beyond Politics. The Beyond Politics party already has its own parody Twitter account. You know you've arrived when someone's parodying you, but whoever organised that has been left in total confusion because it turns out the organisation is not only beyond politics, but it's arguably also beyond parody. Exhibit A this week, announcing its actions on its website headed "We Accuse." In an echo of a famous J'accuse article by Emile Zola, it had this to say: "In ordinary times, we would not dream of throwing paint over your offices. But these are not ordinary times. These are the most extraordinary, bleeped up times in the history of humanity." There is a lot of cursing in this document. Governments are racing us towards extinction, into the indescribable suffering and death of billions of people as they take the world into 4 degrees C of fatal heat, to make vast continents uninhabitable, to slaughter and starve the next generation, all for another few years of profits for the billionaire class. In the face of this monstrosity, what have you done? Bleep all that's meaningful. It is 30 years since we were told we will all die from climate chaos, and you are deluded about how things change. Since the British Parliament announced we are in a climate emergency last year, you have done bleep all. Since the government decided this month it was adapting to the holocaust of a 4 degrees C world, you have done bleep all. Since we wrote to you last week demanding you bring down this genocidal government, you have done, say it with me folks, bleep all. It's a remarkable tirade for sure. Very much a text that bears Roger Hallam's personal hallmark. Obviously, the science references are disconnected from reality. No, governments are not racing us towards extinction. No, there are no scenarios in the IPCC science that predict indescribable suffering and death of billions of people, even if we ended up in a 4 degrees C world, which is not the plan. No, the science doesn't say vast continents will become uninhabitable. This may be one reason why even Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth decided not to overthrow the government within a week, 1 week, of receiving a letter demanding that they do just that. I don't want to speak for them, but it's my guess. Now, there's no arguing with fanaticism, and that's exactly how this reads. And here's how it finishes. "We have no words to describe our disgust. We have no words to describe our rage. We are all complicit, but you have been in charge. which may be news to Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth, and you have utterly, utterly failed. We accuse you of appeasing radical evil. Disband yourselves or drive your organisations into a final battle with this genocidal regime. That means your executives going on hunger strike, your staff going to prison, your supporters blocking the roads. The revolution is on its way. Our sacred right and indispensable duty is to take down the government for its treasonous betrayal and replace it with citizens' assemblies of ordinary people. It's time for you to step up or get out of the way. And they mean it, you know. They've set up a fundraiser with a target of raising £50 million to bring down the government. With 7 days left to go, they're well on target with £260 raised from 7 supporters. Still, we'll see their full might on Saturday this week when they plan to flock to Trafalgar Square to make themselves felt. So there's that to look forward to. I did a video earlier this week talking about predictions. It's worth noting I predicted a year ago that Extinction Rebellion's apocalyptic narrative created a logic that would inevitably lead to the emergence of a radical splinter group. Because a passionate belief that governments are killing us all is the kind of vision that leads to fanaticism, which leads to extremism. I even suggested at some point that Hallam himself might be the catalyst for this, as ordinary, well-meaning people attracted to Extinction Rebellion failed to match his revolutionary ambitions, which they have clearly done. He's lost influence in the organisation that he founded. Whether Beyond Politics becomes that radical group, or whether it's a staging post on the way to it, you read that text and you see the language of fanaticism. I interviewed Roger Hallam a year ago. We had a constructive and respectful discussion. It's hard to read that text and imagine that such a discussion would still be possible. I hope that's wrong. I really do. All right. Just in time for one quick thing that I like. I talked before about cancel culture. I've given long lists of good people who got fired or otherwise cancelled for downright nonsense. Toby Young's not only the founder of the Lockdown Skeptics website, but also the founder of the Free Speech Union. And this week, they got another of the sacked people reinstated. Nick Buckley, MBE, founded the charity Mancunian Way and has headed it successfully ever since. Then he tweeted a criticism of the Black Lives Matter organisation. He described BLM as postmodern neo-Marxists who were calling for the destruction of Western democracy and our way of life. Which is a strong opinion, for sure. Maybe held to be excusable by the fact that it's sort of broadly in line with what BLM founders have actually said themselves. And I mean, this is why various sports leagues and the like have suddenly been distancing themselves, saying that they're supported for the issue, not for the organisation. But the trustees of the charity decided it was beyond the pale, and they sacked Buckley from the charity that he founded to protect the charity's reputation. The Free Speech Union provided him with a top lawyer. A petition supporting him attracted a huge response. The trustees ended up stepping down, a new board was appointed, and they quickly reinstated Nick Buckley back in position. Well done to the Free Speech Union. Let's hope a lot more of the unfair damage done to people on the grounds of a random tweet can be similarly undone in the coming months. Thanks as always to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Your support's incredibly important to this channel, particularly at this point in its growth, and particularly because a lot of the issues I talk about here run the risk of YouTube demonetization. Several more people signed up after last week's episode, and if you'd like to join them in supporting the independent, fact-focused, non-ideological content that this channel aims to provide, please go to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show.